The streets of Florence were always alive, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of freshly baked bread. But for Luca DeLuca, the city was both home and a prison. The heir to a €1 billion empire, Luca had spent his entire life under the suffocating watch of his powerful family. His every move scrutinized, every word measured. To the world, he was just another privileged son of an elite dynasty. But deep inside, Luca wanted more. He longed for freedom, anonymity, and a life he could claim as his own. The pressure of his family's expectations weighed on him like a dark cloud. His father's commanding voice, always urging him to fulfill his duty, echoed in his mind. But Luca had had enough. He couldn't live under that shadow any longer. He didn't want to be Alessandro DeLuca's son. He wanted to be Luca Moretti, the simple man who found joy in books, who could walk the cobblestone streets without a trace of the legacy haunting him. So, he left Florence for Siena, a small town where no one knew his name or the world he came from. Here, he worked at a local bookstore, living in a modest apartment that smelled of old pages and freshly brewed coffee. It was the quiet life he had always dreamed of, a life of peace and simplicity. But his tranquility was soon shattered by a girl with fire in her eyes, Sofia Romano, a passionate and outspoken woman who had no love for the wealthy. It was just another quiet afternoon at the bookstore when she walked in. The door swung open with a force that startled Luca, and in stepped a girl with a determined stride, scanning the shelves with a sharp gaze. She didn't fit in with the usual customers, no polite smiles or forced pleasantries. She was searching for something deeper, something real. "Do you have anything that doesn't involve billionaires saving poor girls?" she asked, her voice filled with irritation. Luca raised an eyebrow, amused. "I think I can manage that," he replied, handing her a novel about adventure and self-discovery. Their fingers brushed as she took the book from him, and for a moment, something electric passed between them. Their eyes locked, curious, challenging, and strangely familiar. She flipped through the pages, nodding approvingly. "Not bad," she said before turning to leave. Luca watched her go, his grin lingering. He had met many people in his life, but there was something different about her. Something about Sofia stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. And he knew, without a doubt, that their paths would cross again. Days passed, and Luca found himself drawn to the cafe where Sofia worked, seeking excuses to see her, to talk to her. And she, in turn, lingered longer in the bookstore than necessary, finding reasons to visit him. The conversations they had were sharp, witty, a battle of words and ideas that left them both craving more. Beneath the teasing and sarcasm, something deeper grew, an undeniable connection that neither of them could ignore. One evening, as they walked side by side through Siena's narrow, dimly lit streets, the weight of unspoken words hung between them. Sofia sighed, her gaze distant. "You ever feel like you don't belong?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Luca hesitated, his heart heavy with a secret he had never shared. "All the time," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He stared down at the cobblestone beneath his feet, the words threatening to spill out, but he held back. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. Sofia glanced at him, her eyes full of understanding. "Then maybe we're both just looking for a place that feels like home," she said softly. In that moment, Luca realized something he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge before. With Sofia, he felt more at home than he ever had in his life. But it was a dangerous feeling, one that could tear him apart. Luca thought he had outrun his past. But his father, Alessandro DeLuca, had never stopped watching. Reports came in regularly, his father's eyes and ears stretched far and wide, making sure Luca was still in line with the family's expectations. But when Sofia entered the picture, the surveillance increased, the reports became more frequent. Alessandro DeLuca was not a man who tolerated rebellion. His son's attachment to a woman from a humble background was a threat to everything he had built. Luca's growing feelings for Sofia were an affront to the empire Alessandro had created. A silent war had begun, and Luca had no idea how close he was to losing everything. Siena's summer festival was a celebration of life, bright lanterns, music, laughter, and the intoxicating scent of street food. Luca and Sofia danced together, caught in the magic of the night, lost in each other. The weight of his family's expectations seemed miles away, and for the first time in years, Luca allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could have this. A life of freedom, of love. But that night, under the glowing lanterns, a figure in the shadows watched them. His cold, calculating eyes locked on Luca, and the moment their gazes met, Luca's stomach twisted with dread. The past had found him. Later that night, a single sheet of paper slipped under Luca's apartment door. The words were simple but chilling. "Come home, or she pays the price." Luca's hand trembled as he read the message. His heart sank. He knew the power his father held, knew the lengths to which they would go to keep him in line. There was no choice. To protect Sofia, he had to leave. He couldn't tell her the truth, not yet. But he knew that if he stayed, she would be in danger. Sofia could sense the change in Luca immediately. His smiles had become forced, his touch hesitant. The man who had once opened up to her was now closing off, retreating behind walls she couldn't break through. One night, as they stood outside the cafe, Sofia's frustration boiled over. "You're hiding something from me," she said, her voice sharp with hurt. "I don't care what it is, Luca. I just need to know if what we have is real." Luca looked at her, torn. He wanted to tell her everything, to confess that he wasn't just Luca Moretti, the bookstore clerk, but Luca DeLuca, heir to an empire. But the weight of his family's warning hung over him like a shadow. "It's real," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes, love isn't enough." Sofia could feel Luca pulling away from her more each day. The warmth between them had turned into an awkward distance, filled with unspoken words and unanswered questions. She refused to believe that what they had was a lie. There had to be a reason behind Luca's coldness, and she was determined to uncover it. Meanwhile, Luca's decision weighed heavily on him. He knew what he had to do to protect Sofia, but it didn't make it any easier. He watched her from a distance, aching for the connection they once shared. But his family's grip was tightening, and he had to stay away, for both their sakes. But the truth couldn't remain buried forever. Secrets always find a way of surfacing. The black car pulled into Siena's quiet streets, its presence like a thunderclap in the stillness of the evening. Matteo DeLuca stepped out, his expression unreadable as he walked toward the bookstore. The moment Luca saw his brother, his stomach churned. "You shouldn't be here," Luca said, barely looking up. "Neither should you," Matteo replied coldly, his voice laced with warning. "Father's done waiting. You know what that means." Luca's fists clenched. He had hoped to escape, to build a life without the constant weight of his family's demands. But it was clear that wasn't going to happen. "I'm not going back," Luca growled, the defiance in his voice unmistakable. Matteo's expression didn't change. "You don't have a choice. And neither does she." The words hit Luca like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. Luca had only one option left, he had to make Sofia hate him. It was the only way to keep her safe. That night, under the cold light of the moon, he met her outside the cafe. His heart shattered with every word he forced himself to say. "We were a mistake, Sofia. I don't love you. I never did." Sofia's face crumpled, the light in her eyes dimming as his words hit her like a physical blow. It took every ounce of Luca's strength not to reach out to her, to pull her into his arms and tell her the truth. But the lie was the only way to protect her. Sofia couldn't sleep. Luca's words echoed in her mind, but they didn't make sense. She had seen the way he looked at her, the way he held her. His words clashed with everything she had felt between them. She refused to believe that he had meant it. She had to find out what was really going on. Determined to uncover the truth, Sofia began retracing Luca's steps. She spoke to people who knew him, sifted through his past, looking for the cracks in the story he had given her. And then, she found it. Luca Moretti didn't exist, not in the way she had believed. Her heart raced as the pieces fell into place. The man she had fallen for was hiding something much darker. But why the deception? What was he running from? The next day, she returned to the bookstore, hoping to find Luca. But he wasn't there. His co-worker, an older woman with kind eyes, stood behind the counter. Sofia pretended to browse, her mind racing. She needed answers. And then, she saw it stacked at the back of the store, a series of old letters. One of them had Luca's familiar handwriting. She grabbed it, her heart pounding in her chest. Before she could read it, the door opened, and Matteo walked in. Sofia froze, the letter gripped tightly in her hands. Matteo's eyes swept the store, as if he could sense something was wrong. She ducked behind a shelf, holding her breath, praying he hadn't seen her. Matteo's voice was low and cold as he approached the counter. "Where is he?" he demanded. Sofia's heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't just a family argument. Matteo's presence meant something darker, something dangerous. She was caught in the web of Luca's secret, and there was no way out. As Matteo turned to leave, his eyes briefly flicked to the shelf where she hid. Sofia's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't dare move. The letter in her hands beckoned, a silent invitation to unravel Luca's past. She unfolded the paper, only to find that it wasn't from Luca. It was a warning. Don't trust him. The DeLuca family always gets what they want. Sofia's mind raced. Who had written this? Why? But before she could process the message, a soft cough interrupted her thoughts. Luca stood there, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and guilt. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had to know the truth," Sofia replied, her voice shaking. "I need to know everything." Matteo's cold gaze swept over the bookstore, as if he knew something was amiss. Sofia's pulse quickened, her instincts screaming at her to run. But it was too late. The DeLuca family's grip had tightened, and there was no escape. Matteo left, but the warning lingered. Sofia's eyes flicked to Luca, her heart aching. What had he been hiding? What had he been protecting her from? The answer was just out of reach, but she knew one thing for certain: nothing in this world could keep them apart now. Sofia's heart raced as Luca stepped closer, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. He was back, but things were different now. The connection between them had deepened, but so had the danger. "You need to leave, Sofia," Luca whispered, his voice trembling with urgency. "My family, they'll come for you. You're not safe." "Who are they, Luca?" Her voice cracked as she spoke. "Who are you?" Luca hesitated, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. "I'm not who you think I am," he confessed finally, his voice filled with regret. "I tried to protect you by keeping you in the dark. But now, it's too late." Sofia stepped closer, her heart breaking with every word. "You think you're protecting me by pushing me away? By lying to me? I deserve the truth, Luca. I'm the heir to the DeLuca empire," Luca said, his voice barely audible. "My family, they'll do anything to keep us apart." A cold silence hung between them. Sofia's mind spun, but she could only hear one thing in her heart: "I can't walk away from him." Luca's confession hung in the air between them like a thundercloud, crackling with tension. Sofia's eyes searched his face, as if trying to decipher whether she had misheard him. But the weight in his voice told her everything she needed to know. Before either of them could speak again, Luca's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. "We need to go. Now." Sofia's pulse raced. "What's happening?" "My father knows you're here," Luca said grimly, gripping her hand. "And he's sending people to make sure you disappear." They slipped out the back of the bookstore just as a black car rolled up the street. The tension in the air was suffocating. Luca's grip on her hand tightened as they sprinted through the winding alleys of Siena. He knew his father's reach, and if they didn't escape now, they never would. Sofia's mind raced. She had never imagined something like this. Just hours ago, she was working at the cafe, thinking about a future with Luca. Now, the life they were trying to build felt more fragile than a house of cards. Every step felt heavier as they ran, but Luca's determination was the only thing that kept her moving. She turned back to look at him, meeting his haunted gaze. "Where are we going?" "To safety," he replied. "I have a place outside the city. We'll lay low there. But we have to move fast." They rounded a corner, and the sound of footsteps echoed ominously behind them. The chase had begun. Sofia had never run so fast in her life. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart slamming against her ribs. They ducked into a small alleyway, pressing their backs against the rough stone wall as the sound of footsteps neared. Luca pulled her close. We can't stay here. I have a safe house outside the city. We need to get there. Sofia's mind reeled. Just hours ago, she was an ordinary woman in love. Now, she was running for her life. Everything she thought she knew about her world was unraveling with every breath she took. Luca's eyes were scanning the street, his face tense with determination. She could feel his worry, his protectiveness, and something else, a deep fear that he couldn't hide. But what was it? Was he afraid for her safety, or was it something more? But the moment they turned the corner, a shadowy figure stepped in front of them. Matteo. It's over, Luca, he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Father wants you back. And he wants her gone. Luca's jaw clenched as he stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Sofia. I'm not going back, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Matteo's eyes flicked to Sofia, then back to Luca. You think you can run from the family? You think she's going to protect you? You're wrong. Sofia couldn't help herself. In a panic, she picked up a nearby glass bottle and smashed it against the stone wall, sending jagged shards flying. She used the broken edge to jab at Matteo, her pulse racing. He barely dodged, but the blade grazed his arm. He cursed under his breath. Luca took that moment to act, knocking the gun from Matteo's hand and pushing him back. Leave us alone, Luca hissed, his breath coming in quick bursts. Matteo's gaze darkened. This isn't over, he spat, disappearing into the night. Luca stood there for a moment, his chest heaving with adrenaline. He had just fought his own brother to protect Sofia. Matteo wasn't the enemy he had thought he was. Or was he? Luca knew his brother, knew how cold and calculating he could be, but never had he thought Matteo would be part of their family's war against him. And yet, here they were, standing in the shadows of Siena, with everything spiraling out of control. Luca turned to Sofia, his face grim. We need to keep moving. My brother isn't going to let this go. Sofia swallowed hard, her mind reeling. The danger surrounding them wasn't just a vague threat anymore, it was real. Her entire world had been shattered in the blink of an eye. We can't keep running forever, she said softly, her voice shaky but determined. Luca nodded, gripping her hand tightly. We're going to fight back. But first, we need to get to my safe house. They started moving again, each step echoing with the weight of their choices. The shadows seemed to stretch around them, as though the very night was closing in. But no matter how fast they ran, the family Luca had tried to escape was still close behind. Luca's voice broke the silence. We can't keep running forever. Sooner or later, we'll have to face them. Sofia looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. And when we do, what then? Luca didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gripped her hand tighter, as if the simple act of holding on was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. They reached the countryside just before dawn, their bodies exhausted and nerves frayed. Luca guided Sofia into a secluded cabin nestled among towering trees. Here we are, he said, his voice rough from running. Sofia glanced around the cabin. It was small and rustic, a far cry from the opulent life she had imagined Luca might be accustomed to. But the peace and quiet were a welcome relief. Here, in this isolated cabin, they could breathe if only for a moment. Do you think we'll be safe here? Sofia asked, trying to calm her racing thoughts. For now, Luca replied, his tone cautious but hopeful. We can lay low here for a while. But we can't stay forever. My father won't stop until he has me back. Sofia's heart ached at the vulnerability in his eyes. The man she had fallen in love with wasn't just Luca Moretti, he was Luca DeLuca, the heir to a powerful empire. And that empire wouldn't let him go so easily. We'll figure this out, she said, trying to convince herself as much as him. Luca looked at her, his expression softening for a moment. I'll keep you safe, Sofia. I promise. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep that promise. The quiet of the safe house felt like a fragile thing, something that could shatter with a single wrong move. Luca knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The DeLuca empire was too powerful, and they would never stop hunting him down. Sofia's face was pale, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and fear. What's the plan? Luca took a deep breath. He had been thinking about this for days, formulating a way to strike back at his father without getting both of them killed in the process. "We need to expose him," Luca said, his voice low and steady. "We have to take down my father, Sofia. It's the only way to ensure we're free." Sofia raised an eyebrow. "Expose him? How? He's untouchable." Luca shook his head. "Not anymore. I have something, a document that can bring down everything he's built. If we release it to the right people, it will destroy him." Sofia frowned. "But won't that put us in even more danger? What if it backfires?" Luca met her gaze. "It's the only way to end this. If we don't do something, my father will keep us in chains forever." Sofia hesitated but nodded. "Okay. What's the next step?" Luca's jaw tightened. "We go back to Florence. I have to get the evidence, and then we leak it to the authorities." It was a dangerous plan, one that could cost them everything. But it was the only plan they had. Luca and Sofia returned to Florence under the cover of night, careful to avoid the prying eyes of the city. The streets were quieter now, with only the faint hum of the city's nightlife in the distance. But for Luca, every shadow felt like a threat. He knew his father's empire, how far-reaching and impenetrable it was. His every step was calculated, and now, as they stood in the hidden vault beneath the DeLuca estate, he felt the weight of their mission. Sofia looked around the dimly lit room, the walls lined with filing cabinets and documents that seemed like relics of another life. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice low and urgent. Luca moved toward a locked cabinet at the far end of the room. He inserted a key into the lock and pulled open the drawer. Inside were stacks of papers, documents dating back years. "Here," he said, pulling out a folder marked with his father's signature. "This is it. The evidence that could take him down." Sofia's hands shook as she flipped through the pages. Her eyes widened with shock as she read. "Luca, your father has been laundering money for the mafia. If this gets out, it'll destroy him." Luca clenched his fists. "I know. But it will also destroy everything he's built. And maybe, just maybe, we'll finally be free." Sofia's voice was filled with disbelief. "But Luca, this is bigger than we thought. Your family isn't just powerful, they're dangerous." Luca met her gaze, his face set in grim determination. "I've spent my whole life trying to escape this world. Now, I'm going to burn it to the ground." With the documents secured and their plan in motion, Luca and Sofia knew time was running out. They had to act fast if they wanted to make sure the information reached the right hands. But Luca's trust in his family was gone, shattered by the revelation that his father was more ruthless than he had ever imagined. The plan was simple: get the evidence out and leak it to the authorities. But nothing in Luca's life had ever been simple. As they prepared to leave the estate, Matteo appeared this time, with a gun aimed directly at Luca's chest. "You never learn, brother," Matteo said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Father wants you back, and if you think you're running away from him, you're wrong." Luca stepped back, his hand instinctively reaching for Sofia. But before he could act, another sound stopped him, Sofia's voice, firm and steady. "Drop it, Matteo," she said, her hand outstretched, a gun now in her grasp. "You won't hurt him." Matteo raised an eyebrow, his usual confidence shaken. "You think you can stop me? You think I'll let you walk away with this?" But Sofia didn't flinch. Her fingers tightened around the trigger, her eyes locked on Matteo's. "Try me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, Matteo's eyes searched Sofia's face, reading the resolve in her eyes. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he lowered his gun. "This isn't over," he warned, his voice low. But they had already won. They had the evidence, and now, they had to get it out. With Matteo subdued and the evidence in hand, Luca and Sofia fled the DeLuca estate. They knew the authorities would be their only hope now. But even as they ran, a sinking feeling settled in Luca's gut. Alessandro DeLuca would never let them go without a fight. His empire was too strong, his grip on the city too tight. "We need to send the documents," Luca said, his voice sharp as they hurried through the narrow streets. "The authorities need to see this, and fast. If they don't, we're dead." Sofia nodded, her face pale. Where do we go? Luca paused, taking a deep breath. I know someone. A journalist who can get the story out to the right people. But just as they were about to make their way to the safe house, Luca's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it made his stomach drop. He answered quickly, his voice tense. Luca, the voice on the other end said, your father knows. He's coming for you. Before Luca could respond, the line went dead. Sofia never saw them coming. One moment she was in Luca's arms, the next she was bound and blindfolded, locked in a cold, dark room. Her head was spinning, and her body ached from the rough handling. The world around her was disorienting, but then she heard the unmistakable voice of Alessandro DeLuca. You took everything from me, Sofia, he said, his voice filled with venom. Now, I'll take everything from you. Sofia's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the situation. She was alone. Luca was nowhere to be seen. Her pulse quickened as she realized the depth of the danger she was in. But even in the face of her fear, one thought rang clear in her mind: Luca would come for her. He had to. Luca's rage knew no bounds. His world had been ripped apart, and now, the love of his life was in danger because of his family's greed. He stormed through the darkened streets of Florence, his mind consumed by the thought of Sofia locked away somewhere, suffering. Where is she? He roared at Matteo, who stood by, watching with a mixture of indifference and concern. Matteo didn't flinch. You know where. Father's estate. And he's waiting for you. Luca didn't hesitate. He would stop at nothing to get Sofia back. The DeLuca family had pushed him too far, and now he was going to make them pay. His hands trembled as he gripped the gun in his pocket. He wasn't sure if it was fear, anger, or a combination of both, but one thing was certain: he wasn't walking away without Sofia. Luca's pulse thundered in his ears as he stormed through the grand estate. The walls seemed to close in around him, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting to Sofia. He found Alessandro sitting at his desk in the study, calm and collected, as though nothing had changed. You think you can win? Alessandro sneered, his eyes cold as he regarded Luca. Luca didn't answer. He raised the gun and pointed it directly at his father's chest. I already have, he said, his voice low and steady. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, it felt like time itself had frozen. But just as Luca was about to pull the trigger, a voice stopped him. Don't do it, Luca. It was Sofia. She was standing in the doorway, her hands trembling but her eyes filled with determination. The sound of police sirens grew louder in the distance, signaling that their plan had worked. The documents had been released, and the DeLuca empire was collapsing before their eyes. Alessandro lunged at Luca, but before he could reach him, a gunshot rang out. Matteo stood in the doorway, gun in hand. It's over, father, Matteo said, his voice devoid of emotion. This ends now. Luca stared at his brother, disbelief flooding him. Matteo had sided with them. With Alessandro arrested, Luca and Sofia breathed a sigh of relief. The chains of Luca's past had been broken. The life they had fought for was now within reach. Sofia looked at Luca, her eyes filled with tears. So, what now? Luca smiled, his heart light for the first time in years. Now, we live. Luca and Sofia moved to a quiet village, far from the chaos of Florence. They found peace in the simplicity of their new life. Luca opened a bookstore, and Sofia began writing again, this time telling their story. For the first time in their lives, they were free. And it was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Luca knelt before Sofia, a ring in his hand. Marry me, he said softly. Tears filled Sofia's eyes. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. As they kissed under the fading light, they knew their story was just beginning. Together, they had overcome the impossible. And now, they would face whatever came next, forever.